Hello, everybody. This is the webyeshiva.org Facebook page, and we are going to be studying today Moreh Nevukhim, our weekly Moreh Nevukhim shir, and we are going to be finishing the 34th chapter of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim today. This is part 6, so we've spent actually 6 different sessions on this particular chapter. 5 causes that prevent the acquisition of esoteric knowledge, or the knowledge of what you could call divine science or metaphysics, and understanding of Hashem and the celestial realm. This was a very important chapter for the Rambam, because the Rambam felt a need to explain that if this is the be-all and end-all of what it means to be a human being, that you can join with God through your intellect, why is it that so few people actually succeed in this endeavor, which is the ultimate objective of all of humanity? And so the Rambam wanted to provide us with 5 different reasons or causes as to why such a small percentage of humanity actually succeeds in obtaining this goal. And in this sense, the Rambam is a religious elitist in the sense that he believes that while the acquisition of perfection within humanity is accessible to most human beings, nonetheless, most human beings never end up achieving the goal that has been placed before them by God. And this is, of course, a very difficult idea to digest. And it's something that's quite controversial, because if the Torah was given to all of the Jewish people, and if there were 7 Noahide commandments that were given to the entire world, could not one argue that ultimately God has lower expectations from the rest of humanity? Why would he set up humanity for failure if only a few choice people in every generation can actually obtain ultimate perfection? This is a question that I think we should keep in the back of our minds whenever we're studying Moreh Nevukhim or other studies of this ilk, where the position, and by the way, this is the general attitude of the philosophical community of the medieval Jewish world, of the Rambam's milieu, such as the Ibn Ezra and other commentaries, who believe that there is an elite class of human beings that God is addressing, and then God addresses the rest of humanity on another level. And so that's something we should keep in mind. We're not going to get too much into that today, but it's certainly something for us to keep in mind. Ultimately, we'll have to resign ourselves to the fact that God is a benevolent God. He's a loving God. So even those who are incapable or fall short of achieving the ultimate challenge for humanity, there is some kind of secondary level that God says is acceptable for the rest of humanity in their service of God. And God accepts that service nonetheless, even though the vast majority will fall short of achieving what for the Rambam would be called human perfection. Okay, we are up to the 5th and final cause of the things in life that pull a person away from achieving that ultimate goal. The first 4 that the Rambam had discussed were the difficulty of the material, the inherent difficulty of the material of studying something that is completely foreign to one's purview of experience. Number 2, the insufficiency of people's minds, that our minds are not used to thinking in certain ways, and also our minds take a long time to develop and mature. Number 3, the immenseness of the prerequisite knowledge that is very daunting and causes most people, through a trait of laziness, to fall short of ever achieving the goal of working through years upon years of preparation to get to the final goal of metaphysics. Number 4, a lack of proper temperament and virtues, which we had explained last week means really 2 things. That there are some people, no matter how hard they try, it's an exercise in futility, because they simply were not born with the potential to reach that goal of human perfection. And number 2, even those who do have the potential, they were born with the innate potential to achieve intellectual perfection, nonetheless, they don't possess the proper temperament or maturity to advance in that endeavor until they get much older. And by that time, sometimes they'll follow through and sometimes they won't follow through. And finally, reason number 5 is that even if a person is able to master the material, and even if he's able to develop his intellect, to be able to hone his mind and to study the things properly, and even if he doesn't have the trait of laziness, he has a tremendous amount of zeal and energy to overcome any daunting prerequisites, and even if he has the proper temperament and virtue, the 5th and final detractor, even if he has all of the other 4 factors covered, is nonetheless the fact that there are going to be certain things that pull me away from this spiritual or intellectual endeavor, and they are called the distractions of the physical world. And what we're going to see now is that ultimately, especially for a generation like ours, this is an extremely pertinent detraction and cause ultimately as to why so few of us in the world today really try to intellectually achieve this kind of understanding of God on whatever level we're capable of achieving, just that there are so many distractions, so many things that pull us away. Sometimes I think that the more that we have access to truth, the more that God sets up roadblocks in front of us to prevent us from getting there. Today, because of modern technology and modern science, we have more access today to the discovery, human discovery of reality, of space, of nature, of biology, of astrophysics, and so forth. And yet, there seem to be so few who actually take up this endeavor to try and connect with the Creator. And that, of course, is because the more we have access to truth, the more roadblocks are put up in front of us, so that as soon as we start having a serious thought about the meaning of life and the ultimate Creator who designed all of this, all of a sudden something comes up in our social media feed that makes us chuckle, and it's a meme or a cartoon of something, and then the whole thing is lost. So anyway, that's a little bit of social commentary. Let's take a look at the text of the Rambam. We are using the Shlomo Pines edition, the Shlomo Pines translation of the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim from Arabic into English. It is published by the University of Chicago Press. It is readily available on Amazon and other book suppliers. You can find the text in the book on page 79, and it's just a short couple of paragraphs, the 5th and final cause. And he writes as follows, and as well, I would also encourage you to open up another tab on your browser and to go to the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, where you will be able to find a handout for today, which only has a snippet from another section of Moreh Nevukhim, which we'll get to in just a second. The 5th cause is to be found in the fact that men are occupied with the necessities of the bodies, which are the first perfection. Okay, so that we have to just unpack this sentence. Basically what the Rambam is saying is that the reason why it's so difficult for people, even those who have the innate abilities and the innate temperament and moral virtue, to be able to acquire these ultimate truths about God, nonetheless, there are so many things in the physical world, in the physical trappings of our lives, that pull us away from that endeavor. And he says that the necessities of our bodies, that's what he calls the bodily needs, taking care of ourselves physically, eating, drinking, working, procreating, raising families, all of these things are included in the bodily necessities. They are the first perfection. Now, what does the Rambam mean by that term, first perfection? So if you have the text in front of you of the entire Moreh Nevukhim, I would encourage you to turn to the 3rd section of Moreh Nevukhim, chapter 27. For your convenience, I have provided you in today's handout with a snippet of that section, the opening portions of that section, that is where I've abridged it and taken out certain passages, which I'd like to learn together with you. It does represent, and it's important to disclaim this, it represents one of the Rambam's most explicit presentations of his most controversial philosophy. And what I mean by that is that what should have become clear by now at the point of our studies in the Moreh Nevukhim is that the Rambam believes that the most perfect and ultimate way of connecting with God is via the intellect. And the key to human perfection is through intellectual perfection. And then the question becomes, well, if that's so, then what is the role of bodily performance of the mitzvot? Do the mitzvot, in and of themselves, bring me to some kind of perfection with God or not? And the question then becomes, if the mitzvot is not going to bring me to perfection because they don't involve an engagement of the intellect, then why is so much space devoted to the bodily mitzvot in the Torah? And why doesn't the Torah just simply say or devote a huge amount of space to the real event, which is engage your intellect, perfect your intellect, do all of the things that are advocated in the Moreh Nevukhim in the pursuit of metaphysics and divine science in order to attach oneself to God ultimately? And this is something that the Rambam undertakes in the third section of the Moreh Nevukhim, because there the Rambam undertakes the important discussion of divine providence and the role of divine service, of human beings serving God in this world, and how that creates an interaction between the human being and God. Okay, but right now, for our purposes, let's find out if we can understand what the Rambam means when he says the first perfection, that attending to one's bodily needs are the first perfection. So take a look. What I've done is I have just downloaded the Friedlander translation of the Moreh Nevukhim, which is available. It's not copyrighted. It's in the public domain. It's readily available on wiki texts and other sources online. And I've just taken a portion of that translation, abridged it for our purposes. So let's take a look. It's in your handout. The general object of the law is twofold. There are two objectives in the Torah that God gave us and the commandments that are contained in the Torah. Number one is the well-being of the soul, and number two is the well-being of the body. So the Rambam really introduces that the mitzvot that God gave to the Jewish people are for our benefit, primarily to perfect our soul and secondarily to perfect ourselves physically. Of these two objects, the one, the well-being of the soul, or the communication of correct opinions, comes undoubtedly first in rank. Now what that means is that Hashem gave us mitzvot in order to cause us to think properly, because the Rambam when the Rambam talks about spiritual well-being, he really means intellectual well-being, because for most of Moreh Nevukhim, the intellect and the soul are really two indivisible things. Really, the soul refers to the intellect, and the intellect refers to the soul. The mind is the repository for the soul, and for us to discuss a distinction at this point between mind and soul really is not a very productive enterprise for the Rambam. They really are used interchangeably. So therefore, a whole body of mitzvot are given to us in the Torah to train us intellectually how we're supposed to think in a way that will make our soul healthiest. Okay? But the other, the well-being of the body, the governance of the state, and the establishment of the best possible relations among men is anterior in nature and time. So what the Rambam just said is that, yes, it's true. The perfection of the soul is the primary objective of the Torah, but the secondary objective of the Torah also comes first chronologically and naturally. And what he means is that while it's true is that it's more important to take care of your soul than it is to take care of your body, nonetheless, taking care of your body comes first chronologically and naturally. Because if you don't have a healthy body, then you can never have a healthy soul or a healthy mind. Okay? The latter object is required first. It is also treated in the law most carefully and most minutely, because the well-being of the soul can only be obtained after that of the body has been secured. And here the Rambam basically says, why does the Torah devote so much space to something which is only the secondary goal? It's like a distant second, which is to take care of your body and make sure that it's healthy. If that's not the ultimate goal, then why does the Torah devote so much space to it? It's very simple. You need to be very, very careful in the details of how you're supposed to take care of your body and your community and your social structure, because without very precise and careful attention to those aspects of human living, you will never be able to perfect your mind. But for the Rambam, those mitzvot that address bodily performance and the structure of societies, the Ben Adam Lechavero particularly, those laws which affect man and his fellow man, all of those laws were structured to make sure that the human being has the ability and has the freedom and has the proper moral temperament to be able to perfect his intellect. It's a means to a greater end, not an end unto itself. This, of course, as I mentioned last time when we talked about the idea of perfecting one's temperament and one's moral content, is a means to a greater end for the Rambam. Very controversial position, but nonetheless very consistent with an Aristotelian ideal on what the goal of ethics is. For it has already been found that man has a double perfection. The first perfection is that of the body, and the second perfection is that of the soul. So it's very, very clear what the Rambam means over here in our section now over here. I'll let you read the rest of the text inside. I think we've read enough of the text. The first perfection, meaning chronologically, what do I need to perfect first in life before I can perfect my intellect? I need to make sure that my body is healthy, because only when I first have a healthy body can I attend to the perfection and the health of my soul, i.e. my mind. So that's what the Rambam means when he says which are the first perfection. And more, we continue now in our text in chapter 34, and more particularly if in addition they are occupied with taking care of a wife and of children. And even more especially if there is in them superadded to that a demand for the superfluities of life, which become an established habitus as a result of a bad conduct of life and bad customs. So the Rambam says not only if you're a bachelor do you have a lot of prosaic physical needs that you have to attend to, but the distractions of your physical requirements are even greater if you take a wife and have to raise a family. So the Rambam's not advocating not getting married, he's just saying that this is the reality. Once you get married, the physical responsibilities become more loaded upon the individual, and it becomes more difficult to devote oneself to metaphysics. And then he says also that this is especially true if you live in a culture where luxury is emphasized and certain things are no longer viewed as niceties, but they're viewed as necessities. It used to be that if you didn't have a hard floor in your house, if you just had a dirt floor, that was sufficient. That was the standard. Now it's considered to be a basic necessity that you either have to have a slab or wooden floors or carpeted floors for your home. So that only creates, I'm just giving an example, that only creates added burdens to take care of my physical needs. I have to work harder to be able to earn a living, to be able to support all of these physical indulgences, and therefore all of this detracts from my ability to acquire ultimate knowledge. Things are so that if even a perfect man, as we have mentioned, were to occupy himself much with these necessary things, and all the more if he were to occupy himself with unnecessary things, and if his desire for them should go strong, he would find that his theoretical desires had grown weak and had been submerged. You will find that you're going to lose interest in the metaphysics, the study of metaphysics and divine science, what he calls theoretical desires, because there's no more time for these things in life. The here and now has become too demanding of my time, of my mental energies, and so forth. And his demand for them would slacken and become intermittent and inattentive. He accordingly would not grasp things that otherwise would have been within his power to grasp, or else he would grasp them with a confused apprehension, a mixture of apprehension and a failure to apprehend. So you would approach the material in a lackadaisical fashion, or in a fashion that would end up providing confusion, or end up with confusion, simply because you're so famished in your head, you're so distracted by all of the things that you've got to take care of. The baby's crying in one room, and your wife asks you to take care, or your husband asks you to take care of a particular chore, and he's in the other room, and you've got a client that's hounding you to take care of a certain product or project, and all of these things are, you even when you find time to sit down and study things like the Moreh Nevukhim, you find yourself tremendously distracted. And that, of course, is why, a shir in Moreh Nevukhim, if we were going to take it seriously, we would have to devote much more time than just a half an hour a week to it. But we're just trying to get the basics. To really delve into this really, really carefully would require a person of leisure to be able to really devote themselves completely to this kind of endeavor. So the concluding paragraph is something that I just want to spend a couple of minutes on. He says, in view of all of these causes, mentioning all of the 5 causes that we've mentioned up until now, these matters are only for a few solitary individuals of a very special sort, not for the multitude. For this reason, they should be hidden from the beginner. You don't want a beginner to start off doing something that is an advanced topic, and he should be prevented from taking them up, just as a small baby is prevented from taking coarse foods and from lifting heavy weights. And so the Rambam concludes by saying that in light of all of that I've mentioned, that esoteric knowledge is so difficult to obtain, and it requires so many prerequisites, and it requires so much investment of time and mental energy. This is not something that I would expose to a beginner who's just beginning his approach to Jewish thought. What I find of interest is that the Rambam compares the intellectual beginner to a child, a young child, and he says that just like a young child should not ingest, should not eat certain coarse foods, that let's say a toddler is not, or a baby within the first year of life certainly can't digest certain things which are meant for adults to eat or older people to eat. Also, so certainly you shouldn't give a person intellectual education that he's not ready for. And then the second analogy that the Rambam makes is just like a child does not have developed muscles to be able to lift heavy weights, you shouldn't burden a person with this kind of information. Now, the question is, and there aren't a lot of commentaries on this, but why does the Rambam use 2 analogies to the exposure of esoteric knowledge to the beginner, to the neophyte? He says it's not healthy, just like certain foods are not healthy for a baby, and asking a young child to lift heavy weights. Why 2 analogies when 1 analogy would suffice? I would like to bring to your attention that the Rambam had already used both analogies in previous chapters. If you do have the text in front of you, it's worthwhile for you to go back. If you look at page 64, which goes back to chapter 30, the Rambam had devoted an entire chapter on the verb achol, which means to eat. And the Rambam had dedicated himself to explaining that eating is a physical act of putting food in your mouth, chewing it, and swallowing it, to provide yourself with physical nutrition, but it can also be used in Scripture to describe the acquisition of knowledge, because just like your body ingests nutritional items to sustain the body, so too the mind ingests intellectual concepts which provide intellectual nutrition, or in the Rambam's parlance, perhaps spiritual nutrition as well. So therefore, eating can be described in terms of physical food, and it could be described in terms of the taking in of intellectual ideas. And the Rambam then, in the following page, in chapter 31, had also mentioned that there are certain things that, no matter how developed a person's intellect is, they're simply not capable of comprehending. And in providing this analogy, the Rambam had said, just because a person has the capability to lift 200 pounds doesn't mean that they're going to have the ability to lift 1,000 pounds. And he talked about it in terms of weightlifting. Just because a person, and he said, but the analogy being, is that just because a person has the ability to comprehend or understand certain more basic ideas doesn't automatically mean that that person will be capable of understanding more advanced ideas. So in the course of describing the ingestion, and then later on in chapter 32, the Rambam had gone back to his analogy of eating when he described Elisha, who he calls Elisha Acher, Elisha ben Abuya, who was later known as Acher, one of the four sages who entered into the Pardes and ended up becoming a heretic. And the Rambam says that based on the words of the sages, it's like a person who ate too much honey and vomited as a result, got sick as a result of eating too much sweet foods. Even though sweet foods is normally good, but if you take it in the wrong measurement or without the proper physical preparation, you can become sick from even the sweetest foods like honey. And that's what happened to Elisha. You therefore see that the Rambam uses both analogies. Just an interesting thought, which is why are both analogies necessary when one analogy would have sufficed? And in thinking about this, and I would encourage you to start to think about the difference between the analogy of ingesting versus the analogy of lifting. The Rambam views the mind as both a faculty that we have within us that ingests, that takes in and absorbs knowledge, just like the stomach takes in food and uses it to nourish his body. And the Rambam also describes the mind as a type of muscle that we have that is capable of doing weightlifting, but not weightlifting of physical objects, but weightlifting of intellectual ideas. Both of those endeavors are things that the human being can relate to because they exist on the physical plane. I would suggest that the difference between the two is as follows. Everyone needs to eat. You need to eat in order to survive. No one can go without eating. However, how you eat makes all the difference in the world. So when the Rambam wants to discuss how the human being is responsible of taking in certain ideas and taking them in a proper measure, he uses the analogy of eating. Your mind was given to you by God because it is as necessary for you to nourish the mind as it is for you to nourish the body. So it is your human responsibility, both Jew and Gentile alike, to nourish the mind, the soul, as much as you have an obligation to take care of your body. Okay? But just like anything that's healthy, which is feeding the intellect, can always be turned into something unhealthy, just like eating can be turned into something unhealthy because you can eat junk food, you can eat to excess, you can eat and make yourself sick, so too, even doing a necessary activity such as feeding the intellect can turn into something unhealthy, and that's what happened to Elisha ben Abuya. Okay? Or in a situation where you're talking about a child who's not yet ready to take in certain kinds of nutritive items because their body is not yet developed in order to be able to digest certain more sophisticated foods, you have to know to start at the beginning and slowly work your way up to the more sophisticated ideas of the intellect. When it comes to weightlifting is not a necessary endeavor for the human condition. Yes, it's true, if I want to become a competitor in the Olympics, or if I want to be able to work in an occupation that requires heavy lifting, such as doing construction work or doing other endeavors which require a strong physique, I have to develop that physique by exercising and developing my body so that I can weightlift. But it's not a necessary endeavor of lifting items in life, right? And because it's not a necessary endeavor, every person has to consider whether I'm cut out to be the strong man in the circus or the weightlifter in the Olympics. There are some people that no matter how hard they try to excel in becoming athletic and excelling in a certain sport, let's say, they simply don't have the natural innate ability to do that. And so therefore I think that perhaps one distinction and one reason why the Rambam uses both analogies is because whereas eating is something that all of us have to do, we just have to make sure we do it in a healthy way, but lifting weights is not meant for everybody. And therefore the Rambam was addressing both kinds of people, both of those of us who were born with the innate ability to pursue metaphysics. We have to know how to start at the beginning. not to get bogged down in the deep end before we've learned how to swim. And number two, even you have to also appreciate that I may not have been born for this kind of endeavor. Maybe I was born to pursue other things, which is why, in the catalog of what we call Judaism, there's so many different entrees to spiritual growth. The Rambam's approach is not meant for everyone, even though the Rambam says his attitude would be, Nunu chaval nebach, that you're not able to join me in the perfection of your humanity. You just simply weren't born into that with that kind of innate ability to do that. And he would say, you're a nunu, you're a nebach, you're an unfortunate person. But nonetheless, I think that there are other ways of looking at it in life other than the way that the Rambam would look at it. And we therefore find that only a small minority of our own kinsmen are really interested in these types of intellectual endeavors. It's not meant for everyone. Okay, we will hold it here for today. That allows us to conclude chapter 34. And the topic of chapter 35 is very, very much connected to what we've been learning today. In that even though the Rambam has gotten through telling us that there are certain ideas that are not meant for the masses and the masses will never have access to, but there are certain basic principles that every being of intellect has the obligation, because everyone has the capacity to appreciate certain basic principles about the Ribono Shalom, about the Master of the Universe, such as his incorporeality, despite the fact that that is not documented explicitly in the Torah. And that is going to be our topic for chapter 35. I look forward to discussing that with you next time. I hope you're having a great day and that you have a great week and that things continue to pick up despite the current pandemic in which we're living. All the best.